Welcome to Dolby Creator Talks. This is a show about how artists use technology to tell their stories, and I'm your host, Glenn Kaiser. Today, we are joined by Director of Photography, Lol Crawley, celebrating his first Academy Award nomination for the incredible cinematography of The Brutalist, which is director Brady Corbet's epic film that's garnering quite a bit of Oscar buzz. Now, if you've heard anything about the photography of this film, then you probably know that it was shot on VistaVision, which is an obscure vintage film camera format from the 1950s, and that Lol used it to make one of the most visually iconic films of the year. So that's where I wanted to start our conversation. Here's Director of Photography Lol Crawley talking about capturing the movie in VistaVision.
Early on, I think there was a little bit of, because obviously the film is projecting in 70mm also, so there was a little bit of a misunderstanding between formats, but essentially it's still 35mm motion picture film. But the best way to describe it is it's like full frame 35. So it's pulling the film through horizontally, much like a stills camera would. So that's an easy way to think about it. As a consequence, it pulls eight perforations of film across in each frame. So you end up with twice the neg area essentially than you would shooting in traditional 35mm cinematography.
That's a perfectly succinct way to describe it. I think, and obviously what you gain by having that larger negative area is finer grain structure, increased clarity and sharpness. I think before we get into, I have a lot of questions for you about the how of VistaVision, but is there anything else that you would touch on in terms of like the why of VistaVision?
It's interesting you mentioned resolution. For us, that wasn't necessarily the desire because we wanted because we were mixing formats. We even had some 16mm and digibeta in there. We wanted a cohesive aesthetic to the film. When you cut to the VistaVision footage, which was the majority of the movie, but anytime there was a cut there, we didn't want it to bump for an audience. The biggest draw of the VistaVision was the field of view. When we tested it at Pinewood Studios, 35mm against 16 against VistaVision, it was like, whoa, suddenly it's like we realized you have this increased field of view. And so when we're filming vistas or the architecture of Laszlo Toth, even portraits, like the moment when Laszlo steps off the bus to meet Attila, his cousin, the VistaVision shot, which is in a lot of publicity of them against the bus, the wonderful thing, it's a little bit like anamorphic in the sense it's two things in one. You get this intimacy, but you also have this wide field of view, and so you see the world and you see the performance. And I think that's what maybe gives the film a certain, helps to give it its grandeur and its kind of debt to early 50s, 60s American cinema.
So in terms of the process, I'm just kind of curious about how you landed on VistaVision. And I mean, essentially it's the same negative area as if you'd shot on 65, right? So wouldn't it have been easier to source 65 cameras, or am I getting that wrong? Was it actually not an issue to source VistaVision?
That's a big jump. If you start shooting 65, it's a big jump because the film stock itself is more expensive. It's a bigger gauge of film stock. We actually looked at shooting 65 for elements of Vox Lux, the film before.
The previous film that you had done.
Yeah. And it's actually difficult. Technically, I think there are less VistaVision cameras out there, but there's less demand on it. So I remember kind of like going to rental companies with Vox Lux and being like, hey, we want to shoot 65. And there being a little bit of like, okay. And I was like, oh, this is interesting. Normally we just ask for the cameras and then, they put them on one side. And then I kind of got the impression that the rental companies kind of didn't want to let them go to a lower budget movie in case a bigger budget movie maybe came along. I can completely understand the economics. And I don't know that for a fact, but I kind of got a sense, I looked at the RE 765s and things like this, and it was just harder to access, harder to get them. I mean, we're really hoping that next time we can explore that. But yeah, so essentially the VistaVision, there was less demand on the cameras. I mean, I know Robbie Ryan had shot them for Poor Things, or certain sections at least for Poor Things. I felt like it was the perfect format, I mean, Brady very much a lot of the movie takes place during the 1950s. So it seemed to make perfect sense that we were using a camera system from that time. That was the thinking.
That makes so much sense to me, and I'm glad you brought up Robbie Ryan because we had him on the podcast last year talking about Poor Things, and I was kind of laughing with him about that point because I know that he shot a lot of VistaVision on some of the on some of the effects elements of that, and before that, the last time I had heard VistaVision was basically ILM in the late 70s, when they sort of, and it was a format that had really kind of fallen out of favor. And my impression at that time was that they kind of hoovered up every camera, in the world and kind of cannibalized all this stuff because they were shooting effects plates. So, but I'm glad to hear that you didn't have any issues with getting cameras and being able to shoot in VistaVision.
No, we got, we shot some elements through Greg Beaumont in LA. He has about 4 or 5 cameras, and then Camera Revolution provided the main camera for us out of London. And interestingly, now, which is getting on for a year and a half, 2 years later, or whatever it was. Subsequent to that, there have been more VistaVision cameras that have kind of emerged, and I've met more people that, I have a VistaVision camera and thing, which is really fascinating and good to hear. So we might see more VistaVision work.
Did the VistaVision format change? Did it change the focal length on your lenses, or what? Did that have any effect on?
Yeah, I mean, this is again sort of elaborating a little further on this idea of the field of view that I was talking about. When we realized that it had this wider field of view, so 50 mil is a 50 mil is a 50 mil. That the focal length doesn't ever change, but suddenly it was like taking the blinkers off. It was like it was opening up this, and we were shooting 1:6:6 as well, so. The native aspect ratio of VistaVision, I think, is 1.5 to 1. So it was very, very close. It was a lot closer. That's another thing to say about not shooting 65. You are utilizing much more of the negative with VistaVision than you would with the 65, because it lends itself closer to that aspect ratio. Once we realized that we had this increased field of view per lens, it meant that if in order to capture the architecture or the vistas, with less distortion, we could achieve that, because if you want to, you're often forced onto a wider angle lens in order to capture all of that, which, as we know, sort of has a tendency to distort the wider you go. And, historically, to truthfully capture architecture, you would be using swing and tilt lenses and things like this, or rectilinear lenses, and we weren't necessarily using those. I think the thing about it was that all of these things elevate it or allow the VistaVision, the argument for VistaVision, to not be a sort of affectation or a gimmick. Like it really earned its place, especially when you see the vistas of the Carrera marble quarry, for example. And I mean, any place, it just sort of, I feel very, very, very good about having chosen that format.
It's remarkable, and I may be completely off base here, but I was kind of captivated by there were a couple of times when I noticed really striking sort of vertical lens flares. Is that an artifact of VistaVision?
No, that was actually something that was something very intentional and very difficult to achieve. We had Lester Dunton joined us. Lester Dunton and Joe Dunton come from a sort of long lineage of associations with Kubrick and lens design, and they're basically Lester takes his 435 RE435 camera and he puts it in maintenance mode. So essentially, what's happening is obviously in correct operating procedure of 35, 24 times a second, the film stops momentarily and then is exposed, and then off we go again. Now with this, when it's in maintenance mode, what happens is as the shutter is open, the film is also pulled through. So you end up with this sort of smearing effect. But interestingly, it doesn't smear the entire image. It really just adheres itself to the highlights, so the highlights have this kind of smear effect. I mean, I don't know the math of kind of how, presumably it has to stay static for a percentage of the time and then is pulled through, which would presumably mean that you have a stable image and smeared highlights. I didn't dig into the mathematics that clearly, but essentially there was a film called Love is the Devil, a John Mabry movie from the late 90s. And I'm a big fan of this movie, and John Matheson shot it. And they'd used this device in order to mimic the Francis Bacon paintings, like the cardinals or the smeared, skinned bodies and things. So really it was a device that it was an approach that I took to Brady, and he really embraced. And it was tricky to achieve, but we pulled it off, I think.
I love the way anytime you can use cinematography to kind of give the audience the subjective experience that your main character is. I mean, you have some wonderful opportunities in this because your main character, Laszlo, has a bit of a heroin problem, as it turns out. So. Yeah. And you've got some really interesting opportunities. And I was also just struck by that fantastic look of the jazz club sequence. You're really having. Oh, yeah. I feel like you got to have a lot of fun with this.
We did. I mean, I've spoken about this, but I think the idea of the jazz club, for us, it was it was 2 p.m. on a Tuesday on day one of filming, right? And it's supposed to feel like 2 a.m. on a Sunday morning, hedonistic, kind of high, drunk. And so we really had to try and create that on the day. And I think we were very successful in doing it. And we had Daniel Blumberg's score, that part of it had already been written. So we had a jazz club there, a jazz band rather, that was playing in the club. And, and normally, you cut the music and then do the performance. Well, this was just like, let's create the club. And I felt like it, it was like, as I say, it was the first day with Adrian and Isaac de Monclay, and I think it just calibrated us, everybody. And I feel it was like, everyone was like, okay, all right, this is what we're doing. Okay, this is good, And I think, there's me and Brady sort of like urging the background actors to come through and to, and they're sort of nervous because it's Tuesday after, and they, they're not, everything is against us, so you're trying to kind of rip out that self-consciousness that everyone's feeling. And I'm on my back with a handheld camera, 10 mil, whipping it from Adrian to the band. And then I've got another camera, and I haven't, haven't worked with this operator before, so I'm thinking, well, I know that I'd be surprised if they're doing what I'm doing, because it felt so kind of like, so kind of crazed what I was doing. And some of that, it was great, but we had to all calibrate each other and encourage each other, I think, to be like, to go to the end stop of this kind of manic behavior, manic image making.
I would love for you to talk a little bit about this. I've got some questions about some specific scenes that I wanted to ask you about. One of the things that I'm so fascinated by. There's a wonderful scene with Laszlo and Van Buren after the Christmas dinner when they walk up to the top of the hill.
Oh yeah,
and Van Buren reveals his plan to hire Laszlo to build the institute. And I feel like it would have been like the easier cinematic thing would be to say, let's shoot this at golden hour, and have everything be lovely that way. But you made it even harder for yourself, because I feel like you were in that little narrow window after golden hour, but before darkness, which doesn't last very long. And you got like, what was it like? It seemed like that was like a 5 or 6 minute dialogue sequence.
It is no coincidence that fate brought us together on the eve of my mother's death. I'm good at reading the signs.
Sir, I do not know what the commission entails.
We'll talk about the details at home, but you'll be well compensated. And also, you'll be given a place here on the property to live and work. I think that residing here will allow you the time and the space to conceive of it properly. And your family, should they arrive, they're welcome here too. What do you say?
Tell me about the process for shooting that. And did you shoot that was that something that like you had to run up there and get shots over multiple days to kind of fit in that window of available light for that?
No, we managed to achieve it all in the one on the same day in about 45 minutes. I mean, obviously we'd rehearsed and blocked and everything before that. My memory is it went something like this, that we wanted it to feel post sunset, right? And then preceding that, there was a moment where they're crossing the bridge and they have these torches and lamp lights, and Van Buren's like, I have an announcement, you know, and then they all trek from the house. Now that, you know, as you know, in one shot, you know, we did that in magic hour as one traditionally would, or not even magic hour, in twilight half an hour, right? So we managed to do that, but then, so that kind of informed the look. But then we were like, okay, everything else has to match that. So the idea was that we would, you know, hopefully it would be a cloudy day, and then therefore, if there's no direct sun, then we can, even if the sun's still in the sky, technically we can time it down. And I think it happened that like, it was one of those days where it was like, then about half an hour before sunset, the sun came out. So then it was like, well, we couldn't shoot. And Brady's like, oh, so we're not shooting that. I'm like, no, we're not, you know. And as I'm saying it, I'm kind of thinking, you know, I'm just making a rod for my own back here. Like I'm, you know, I was like, wow, this, you know, it's a bit like, you know, brace yourself, don't, you know, hold it. It's kind of, you know, and then go, you know. And it's a real testament to, you know, to the blocking of the scene, to Brady's direction, and of course to the performances, that they managed to pull it off in the time it was, which was basically like 45 minutes. And and also our operator, Attila Pfeffer, our wonderful Steadicam operator, and our focus pullers, of course. I mean, it was single camera, as I recall. I mean, certainly the majority. I can't think where else we put a camera on it. But the interesting thing is, I think aesthetically, you know, the French call it the time between the dog and the wolf, this kind of twilight, which is there is something very unsettling in a way about, you know, the coming of the night and the departure of the day. I mean, it's you know, historically it would have been a very unsettling time, you know, you know, that's where the bad things happen, and so I think there's something really interesting about it in the movie, you know, because it's supposed to be this optimistic kind of celebratory thing, and yet the whole thing is imbued with this slightly odd sort of light, you know, and with our color timer, Mate, we sort of also kind of pushed in this silvery kind of quality to it. And Brady has spoken about it and said it's almost kind of like you shouldn't be seeing it. Like it shouldn't, the audience is in some unconscious way seeing something that they either don't normally see or shouldn't normally see. It's the same with kind of Lars von Trier's Melancholia. There's this kind of disconnect of light or something that is, let's say, kind of unsettling or uncanny, you know, like in a Gregory Crutzen or a Todd Hido photo or something, you know. And I think hopefully it has some of that in it as well. So not everything is to be, you know, the celebrations are not to be trusted in some way.
I love the way you describe that because, of course, you know, having seen the film, knowing what's to come, you're kind of foreshadowing that.
Well, it's a little Faustian pact on top of a hill. You know, you take the shilling, you got to take what comes with it. You know.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. You kind of teed up another question that I had for you, which is, I understand that Brady doesn't shoot a lot of coverage. So tell me kind of about like, do you rigorously storyboard, like, or is there a shot list, or how do you know, if he's not going to shoot a lot of coverage, how do you plan for what you need to get, and how do you know you got it?
Yeah, it's a good question. We don't storyboard a lot. There was one scene in the movie that was storyboarded, which was the dome scene. And it's not, in my opinion, like the most it's successful, but it's not I think it's not the most alive. Like I think the fact that we don't storyboard, and we've you know, it's always been the approach over the 3 films we've done together is to always let the life in, you know, let the moment offer something new, you know. And I think the danger with sort of looking down at a something you've sat in a room 2 weeks ago and you sort of put A to B to C to D, then it's only as alive as that moment. Do you know what I mean? You're restricting it in some way. So I think we're always open to something happening. But then, we shot 33 days for like $10 million. You've got to be prepared. Otherwise your days just go. But how do we do that? I mean, we shot list for sure. But often Brady has, he'll often have a very strong idea about, covering scenes in one shot, like where Erzsébet's character accuses Van Buren of his attack. That is a very, very, very ambitious thing to achieve. But once you get the scene on its feet, then once you've got that one shot, then you're off it.
I see what you're saying. Yeah, that's your day, right? Basically, you got the one shot and you're done.
2/3 of the day or whatever it was. But generally we never have a schedule long enough to do it in an entire day. We always try and squeeze something else back in. We'll probably schedule-wise put it on the back end, TBD, like time permitting or something, and if we're lucky enough. So that's we try and obviously squeeze as much into the day as possible. But yeah, I think also it's this idea that like, I can't imagine never doing anything with Brady where we have multiple cameras and then we're just kind of fishing for stuff. Like there's always a language to the film, and that language comes out of. I mean, often it's we don't really wait till the day of shooting to figure it out. But the good. I mean, this has happened early on in our relationship, but if you're aligned creatively and your tastes are pretty much aligned, and you're both quite pragmatic and responsible and cut your cloth accordingly, which I think Brady and I both do. If you go in armed with those things, you can pretty much figure it out, and it's there's not a lot of head scratching between Brady and I. We see the scene, we get it on its feet. We discuss the coverage and then we light it and we start shooting.
You just teed up so much. I mean, we could talk for a couple of hours about what you just mentioned. So I wanted to ask you about these oners, and I think maybe the highest praise that I can give is that I didn't realize that there were so many oners in this film until the second time I saw it. They just it just sort of naturally played for me and didn't call attention to itself. But you brought up that remarkable oner with Erzsébet and the confrontation with Van Buren. And like, that's just not a simple oner. Like you're upstairs, downstairs, following people all over the place. Like, and this is this is an old mansion with a lot of dark wood and it's nighttime. And like, that just seemed like what a challenge to light that scene so that you could actually have that much continuous movement through it.
It was a challenge to light it. I mean, I suppose the one place you don't really see is directly above in the foyer. So we had some, obviously a sort of ambient source. I regard as often like a room tone of light, It's sort of, not as sort of like, there's obviously a distinction. I always say there's a distinction between illuminating and lighting. You can illuminate a scene, but you're not really telling the story. You're just allowing the viewer to see it. So we obviously try to avoid illumination, but I think you set a kind of base room tone and then you try and then you accent the light from there. But we didn't have a big VFX budget, so it wasn't like we had lights in that we could just paint out later and things like that. So I just hid them wherever we could, and it was quite challenging because I remember when the Steadicam pushes in and we finally reveal the dinner party or the little dinner party that they're having in the thing. To the left of the frame, their backs got quite hot. There was a lot of source of light there, but not a lot of room to cut it. So it will have been softer LED lights, but there's not a lot of room to cut it off the floor, and then they end up getting quite bright on their backs and things. So obviously there was work we did in the DI to bring some of that down, but I really love to try and get it as close as I can in camera as possible, and Attila Dodzi, our gaffer, was riding some of the levels and things like this. I do remember there's one bit at the end of that scene where we chase Joe Alwyn up the stairs, and then he disappears, then he comes back. And as we pivot, as he crosses us and we sort of pivot, and then it turns from a leading moment to a follow, I see the camera sort of duck down, and I was like, oh, I think that's where our lights were, like sort of went down to his hand on the banister. And I don't remember if Attila did that instinctively, or if I said to him, look, you cannot get those lights in shot, so it may have been that. So there were little corners where I managed to sort of hide things. But, interestingly, coming back to the idea of the Wanner, Brady said, okay, so I want this to all be a Wanner, and I want it to feel like a Steadicam shot that turns into a handheld shot and then a Steadicam shot. But I don't want to do it as two different versions, And so I've never seen anybody operate in this way before. But Attila, basically the point where Joe Alwyn suddenly comes out of nowhere and rips Ejebet's walker to the floor, it turns into this Steadicam until Ejebet gets dragged by Joe Alwyn across the floor, which is kind of this horrific, ugly moment. And Attila was literally sort of like operating the camera as a handheld camera, but it was still attached to the steady rig. So it was the most extraordinary kind of like operating I've ever seen. I mean, really wild. And he just went with it. So it was. So Brady will just say early on, a lot of the time there's dialogue and there's collaboration and and things evolve. Sometimes he'll have a clear idea and it's my job to execute it. I did at one point sort of have a concern about the fact that we were just panning to profile on Felicity whilst the accusation is happening, and I was like, what, there's no other kind of coverage onto the, and it's interesting because it's like you realize you're in a real safe pair of hands with a director who's like so assured. I mean, I might ask that to another director as a DP, and they're like, "Oh, okay, well, we'll add another shot then." And as soon as you add another shot, you add more takes, and your day just becomes exponentially like the branches of a tree. Suddenly, your day goes. And so, I think as a DP, I'll often ask the question, but I'm not precious about it, and I don't imply with my suggestion or my question that the director doesn't know what they're doing. It's just, if something occurs to you, you ask the question. If they say, no, thank you for suggesting, but I don't need it, then it's not my job to kind of suddenly get into it on set with them about it.
Let the picture editor have that conversation with them. Well, I have to say, another one of the Wanners that maybe my favorite one is it's in New York, in the second half of the film when Van Buren's lawyer, Michael Hoffman, tracks down Laszlo at the architecture firm. And again, you're going upstairs, you're shooting into windows and around, like it just must have been what a challenge. And first of all, that location was fantastic. Was that a practical location in Budapest?
Yeah, it was. I think it was a university. But when we first went in and they said, this is, when I first saw it, I think maybe it was a scout or maybe it was a tech scouts who had already committed. But essentially the ceiling had hundreds and hundreds of light bulbs that we then had to swap out, for brighter bulbs, have more control. But Brady really wanted to embrace that. It was indicative of a certain time. And I think it's 1958 at that point in the movie. Brady's never explicit, so you hear it in the radio broadcast. But there's a jump in time. Laszlo's been dismissed. The institute is being put on hold, or even abandoned, really, at that point. So I think it was really, interesting for Brady and Judy Becker, our designer, that this signified something. That this architecture. Or this interior design that we really wanted to see it. But yeah, again, it's Attila doing this beautiful Steadicam move. And I think it's really interesting you look at like scenes from Jaws or David Lean, who, influenced Spielberg, thinking specifically about sort of Spielberg Jaws moment where they're on the dunes having having a conversation, and by the end of it, it's this wonderful 2-shot looking up with the graffiti, with the shark drawn on the billboard, and you're like, that's magnificent. So this idea of kind of shots evolving, I think is kind of classic cinema in many ways, in the best possible way. That it evolves the scene and pushes the story forward, and yet you're able to do it in these single shots.
The thing that I love about them is that it's storytelling that's appropriate for what you're trying to say. And so to me, watching that sequence, what it told me was like Laszlo, who had kind of gone from being the hero of the story with the building of the Institute, he's literally tucked way back into a corner, yes. One of many draftsmen. Yeah. Like his status has completely changed, and you communicated that visually so beautifully with that shot. So to me, that was just pure storytelling.
It's interesting that in some ways, like there are a couple of moments in the movie where you see Laszlo kind of at peace. And one is once he's designed the library, the first library commission. And maybe in some ways, it's also that moment you've discussed, because he turns to the camera. And even though he's older, he doesn't seem, he seems somehow kind of he's come to terms with it or something. There's a kind of beautiful expression that Adrian has. And he's obviously pleased to see his friend, and that's part of it. But it also feels a little bit like he's not tormented daily by this institute.
Obviously, I have to bring up, to me, one of the most iconic shots in the film, which is it's at the beginning of the film when Laszlo is arriving in New York and he comes up out of the bowels of the ship. And, I love the way you let the highlights completely blow out, which is, of course, like it's almost like he's being dazed after coming out of the darkness from the ship. And that iconic shot that I feel is becoming iconic of the Statue of Liberty upside down, which thematically is so powerful.
Most már bizonyos vagyok, nem marad számunkra semmi itt. Menj Amerikába, és én követni foglak. Hűséges szerelmen, Erzsébet.
But since you and Brady don't storyboard, was that sort of a happy accident that you guys figured out on the day? Was that a shot that you knew that you wanted to frame and present that way?
It was all very planned, and there's two distinct parts to it. One is the handheld operating that I did with Laszlo, and interestingly, you don't know where he is. You could still be in the camp, so it's our first time we see Laszlo. So are we back in Bokenveld? Are we, where is he? He's disorientated. He's alarmed. We're in the darkness. By the end of it, it's this celebratory, euphoric sort of, he's spat out into the New York harbor, and so that was all, even though that's, it could be one take, but it was actually, I think Brady said it was one take, like take 5, for example, but was cut. It was almost jump cut or was cut on the wipes or when the camera pushes into Adrian's back. And then the images were flipped as well by David Janshko and Brady, which I didn't know was going to happen. So in a way, it's sort of after shooting it, it was at more sort of obfuscation and disorientation was added to it, which I think was really, really effective. And then the only real stitch, is kind of like other than those moments is it cuts to this moment in the harbor which we'd shot in New York Harbor on a VistaVision on a long lens. Now that was a kind of born out of a discussion of how we were going to represent the Statue of Liberty, but again editorially the sort of twisting and the spinning was an editorial choice. I wasn't physically operating the camera in that way, but we always knew that there were other versions we spoke about where maybe we were looking completely in like up completely up at the statue, but we're completely within the metalwork, as it were. So it became very, very abstract, and then it would sort of unfurl itself, and then you might see a glimpse of torch and face, and then you're like, so as if you were right up against, underneath it on a ship, which of course you can't achieve because it's on a plinth and on an island. You'd have to get a techno crane and sort of, it would be its own thing. So yeah, I mean, I think what's really interesting is Brady often has this kind of like, Brady and I, because I'm talking about the lighting as well, there's often this naturalism to the lighting or to the language. And then there are these moments where it suddenly tips into something that is completely stylized or is a representation. I mean, there's no way that Laszlo would ever see it that way. But it's a representation to the audience and to Laszlo of that, and this, it's like the same Peter Bradshaw was saying, like it reminded him of the Planet of the Apes, because if you see the Statue of Liberty in a completely different context or upturned or walking through New York in Ghostbusters, there's something clearly wrong, because it's something that, represents certainty and hope and, liberty, of course. Like everything it represents is supposed to stand firm. And, in these times of, that we are in, America, the best America can be is to offer immigrants this certainty.
Of course, I have to ask you about the Carrera, the marble quarry sequence in Italy, and those. I mean, vistas in VistaVision, it's just jaw dropping. Tell me about shooting in that location. And how lucky did you get with that weather, with that amazing fog that came in?
Unlucky with the weather. If you were to ask me on the day, I mean, this is what's really, really fascinating about filmmaking and I guess other art forms as well. But often what you think is you failed, what you think you failed at on the day, often in context, and it's often about context, is a success, and vice versa. What you might have been applauding, slapping yourself on each other's backs as you walk away on the day might not even make it into the movie, So it is really about context. And sometimes I've had very bold underexposures that I've thought of would be reshoots. And in the context, they've earned their place in the film. So, it's a really interesting idea that. And so coming back to the idea of when Laszlo and Van Buren are being shown this marble, the whole point of going to the Carrera marble quarries was we were supposed to see these galleries. They call them these galleries, these kind of these attacks on the landscape where they've extracted marble since Roman times. They were supposed to be the vista that we were going to shoot, and everything was like shrouded in fog, But then when you see it, and then this character, this mysterious character, is talking about beating the corpse of Mussolini and things. It becomes this like incredible, incredible combination of story and aesthetic, and everything supports it. And then, Van Buren's fetishistically sort of like rubbing his face against the cold marble and things, And so it's really, luckily we did get we were there for 2 days and we did get a clear day. So that whole introduction, like it would have been a shame.
That whole thing was only 2 days?
Yeah. Including the scene where they're talking outside of the cafe.
In the cafe, yeah.
So I think we had that day, and then we had the like what we would call B-roll, but we like to call more like illustration or something like of like these VistaVision pans across the landscape and stuff. So I think we had that on a day, and then I think we had a day, like doing the stuff in the fog. It was kind of a combination, but it was a 2 days sort of at the end of the shoot kind of skeleton crew,
Now, I just want to make sure did you say you shot the film in 33 days, 32 days?
Yeah, 33.
That is amazing. And you netted out what a picture of quite a lot of movie in 33 days.
Yeah. A couple of movies in one, really. It's,
But to your point, that's really interesting because, you know, if it had been a bigger budget film, you know, and you could have waited for the fog to lift in Italy, but then
that's true. No, that's right. No, it's interesting. I mean, it does slightly come back to this idea of like, and I've said it before, but like Christopher Doyle has this quote about, you know, there's one sort of like group of, you know, he calls it Western cinema, but it's fairly kind of like, you know, it's a little, you know, it lacks nuance, but he's basically saying that you say, here's the frame, how do we fill it? And in Asian cinema, you say, here's the world, how do you frame it? And one is about imposition, and one is about saying, no, this is what we want, this is correct. And therefore, in that instance, yes, we will remain until it is how we want it. And the other thing is, well, no, maybe we look at it another way, and we, you know, something has happened that we should maybe not jump up and down about, but or if we do jump up and down, maybe we should celebrate it as you know. So I think it's kind of an interesting sort of philosophical discussion in some ways, where you're sort of like, you know, the might, you know, this idea of just having might and control and power and denying something is maybe not always the right direction, you know.
I'm so thunderstruck by what you were able to accomplish given the resource limitations. I mean, I just got back from Sundance, where I watched a lot of low budget indie movies, and you know, they would have the Q&As afterwards, and the director would say, you know, like, oh, we shot the movie in 18 days, and the audience would gasp. Or then the next one would say, we shot the movie in 16 days or something. And it almost becomes like a badge of pride, of honor, like how fast could we shoot these movies? But they also, in some ways, kind of look at, you know, like there's not a lot of time for lighting, so they're pretty flat. Sure. And given how fast you guys shot this thing, I'm in awe of the intentionality of the imagery and the complexity of the lighting and how beautiful it is.
Well, thank you. I mean, I think it's yeah, you know, I don't tend to, even if I had all the time in the world and all the budget, I don't tend to overlight. And it's kind of this idea again. I mean, I need to tell the story. So if it's a sunny day or if it's seasonal or, you know, then of course I'm not shooting a documentary, you know. Of course there's lighting, but I'm also kind of like, sometimes a location will be presented to me by Judy and Brady in the locations department, and they're presenting it to me because they like the location, not because they're like, well, we like the location, but can you completely relight it? You know, like, you know, it's just not in the sort of like spirit of the film. And so I think a lot of the time I am lighting, but I'm also trying to be like, some of my thing is like, well, some of my role as a cinematographer is to know when to leave it alone. And, you know, the lighting truck is in some ways an insurance policy, right? Or you don't always have to use it. You know, you know, you've got it there, but if something is beautiful, then why spend that time changing it? And if you recognize that it's, you know, if you recognize that the scene is well told, the story is well told in that moment, then sometimes that's what you're employed to do. You know, it's interesting, like Robbie Mueller and, you know, specifically, you know, who, it's, you know, like he recognized that, you know, and so often it's like, it's about denying light or shaping light or, you know, the available light, as opposed to kind of like, needing to light every single scene artificially.
Well, Lol, it's been great to talk to you today. I really enjoyed the film, and congratulations on your Academy Award nomination. Very well deserved.
Thank you.
And it's been a pleasure to talk to you today. Really appreciate it.
You too, Glenn. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Many thanks to Lol for joining us on the podcast today, and an extra special thanks to our friends at A24 for helping us put this conversation together and for providing those fantastic clips. Be sure to check out The Brutalist ahead of Oscar Sunday, March 2nd at the Dolby Theater here in Hollywood. You can find links, as always, in our show notes. And speaking of Oscar Sunday, this was actually our final interview for the 97th Academy Awards coverage. And I'm delighted to share that in the categories of cinematography, original score, and sound, we've managed to interview every one of the nominees and nominated teams. In fact, we will be releasing our annual Oscars Roundup episode shortly, with clips from each one of those conversations. So be sure you're subscribed to us here at Dolby Creator Talks. As of this week, Oscars voting has begun. And since many of these awards are tough to pick and predict, hopefully you'll find these in-depth interviews filled with unique insights into the work of these nominated artists might make it just a little bit easier for you to fill out your Oscar ballot, whether you're an Academy voter or you simply want to do better in your annual Oscar office pool. As always, you can find links to our show on all the major podcasting platforms, including the video version on YouTube in our show notes, or you can simply search for Dolby wherever you get your podcasts. If you're curious to know more about what we do at Dolby Creator Lab, head on over to dolbycreatorlab.com. There you'll find information about all of our programs. You can access the entire library of episodes of the show, and you can sign up for our mailing list. Until next time, this is Dolby Creator Talks. I'm your host, Glenn Kaiser. Our producer and editor is Michael Coleman. Our executive producers are Amanda Schneider and Jack Ferry, with additional editing by Matt Nixon. And our production coordinator is Karen Marroquin. Thanks for joining us.